My name is Ginger. I'm a dietitian at Northwestern Medicine at Delnor with the Cardiac and Pulmonary Rehab. And today we're going to do some healthy eating class. So we're basically going to follow along in the booklet that you should have, the Heart Healthy Nutrition. I skip around a little bit, but I will mention pages so that hopefully you can follow along pretty easily. Okay, so first we talk about food intake patterns. It's on the first page, page number 1. And this is for anyone who is concerned about calories and weight control. So it gives a nice variety of calorie levels and recommended serving sizes for each calorie level. When it talks about cups as serving sizes, that's pretty easy. You can use measuring cups to estimate your serving size. When it talks about servings itself, like for example, dairy, it talks about 2 servings, and for starches, it talks about servings as well. If you turn to the next page, on page 2, it gives you examples of serving sizes. And I like to point out a few of those serving sizes because they vary a little bit. For starches, a serving size in general is a half a cup. So a half a cup of oatmeal, a half a cup of pasta, a half a cup of rice, that's all considered a serving. Now that's not necessarily mean you have to only have a half a cup at each meal, because again, if you look at the food patterns, for 1,600 calories, you get 6 servings of starches in a day. So you can divide that up however you would like, whether it's 2 servings at each meal, 1 serving as a snack, 2 or 3 servings at another meal. Again, if you're watching calories, this is a nice way to keep within a calorie level. Okay, so back to starches on page 2. Other examples of servings would be a slice of bread or toast, a small pancake, or a half of an English muffin or bagel are all considered a serving size. Popcorn, if you enjoy popcorn, that's a nice fibrous snack, and low fat as well if you limit the butter or avoid butter. That's a serving size is 3 cups of popcorn. Okay, the other serving size again I mentioned is dairy, so a cup or 8 ounces of milk or yogurt. Or for cheese, it's 1.5 ounces, and that is about the size of the Kraft American single slices. So that's about the size of 1.5 ounces. Okay. For other serving sizes, again, they're pretty self-explanatory because they use regular kitchen measurements like cups and teaspoons or tablespoons. So again, that's a very helpful tool if you're looking out for portion control and calorie levels. Okay, let's move on. The next page, on page 3, is the food label, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of the talk, just because I like to explain about fats and sodium and other nutrients, and then you can talk about the food label. So let's move on to page 4. This talks about fats. And fats take up a lot of the discussion, so does sodium, during this class, because those are 2 key nutrients that we want to look out for cardiac and pulmonary rehab. So on page 4, there's a table. It's in different shades of purple, and that's a nice reference for looking up the reference values for your lipid profile. So when you get a blood draw and they measure the amount of fats in your blood, this is the reference to look at to see if you're within the recommended amounts for cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. So just as a little reminder, you might have heard of these things before. The HDL stands for high density lipoproteins, and they are considered the good fats. They are the fats that help your body transport fats to your liver to be disposed of. Whereas the LDLs, that stands for low density lipoproteins, and those are considered the bad fats in your bloodstream because those are transporters that help transport fat to be stored. And some of this has a lot of this has a genetic component as well, but diet plays a part in altering your levels of HDLs, LDLs, and even triglycerides and cholesterol as well. And we're going to talk about how we find those things in foods. Okay, so on page 5, we're going to talk about the different fats that we find in foods. So first, we're going to talk about saturated fat. Now, saturated fat is fat that comes from mostly animal products, but we find it pretty much in any food source that has fat. But it's mostly found in animal products. So things like beef, pork, dairy like cheese and whole milk, cream, things like that. Saturated fat is the fat that is found to cause clogs in your arteries. So that's the one we want to try to limit. And really, probably if there's one thing you want to focus on with fats is limiting saturated fats in the diet. So we'll focus on that again a lot more. Unsaturated fats are the good fats in our diet. Those are found mostly in plant-based foods, so things like fruits and vegetables, also in whole grains, seeds, nuts, legumes. So again, you can find all these different types of fats, both saturated and unsaturated, in many different foods, but they're a little bit more concentrated in certain ones. So like I said, the saturated fats are more concentrated in animal products, the unsaturated fats are more concentrated in plant products. We can divide the unsaturated fats into two different categories, polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. Both have good health qualities that we like. Monounsaturated fats have been studied a lot when it comes to things like olive oil. It's been shown to be heart healthy. But polyunsaturated fats have some good qualities too. In fact, a specific kind of polyunsaturated fat that we'll talk about in a little bit are omega-3 fatty acids. So both of those are considered very good. And having more unsaturated fats in your diet can help improve those fats in your blood, like the HDLs, increasing the HDLs and lowering the LDLs. Okay, the last type of fat that we find in our diet that we're going to talk about today are called trans fatty acids, or trans fats. So trans fats are found in foods, mostly in foods that are processed or man-made. They are found very little, in nature they're found very little of trans fats. So the good news about trans fats is most food manufacturers now have eliminated trans fats, but we still find a few in foods. So a great example would be things like margarine. Margarine used to have a lot of trans fat in it, especially stick margarine, because what trans fat is made from hydrogenated vegetable oil. What that means is that some food scientists took vegetable oil and changed it chemically to try to make it act more like, say for example, butter. Scientists made margarine from vegetable oil to make a replacement for butter. Well, butter has saturated fat, whereas vegetable oils have more unsaturated fat. So they had to change that chemical composition to make margarine have the characteristics like being more solid at room temperature rather than liquid at room temperature. And what happens are trans fats form. So unfortunately for trans fats is that they act a lot like saturated fats and they're not heart healthy. We want to try to have zero trans fats in our diet. So some of the new tub margarines have very little or even no trans fats in them. So those would be a good choice as far as spreads are concerned. Okay, on page 6, there's a chart that shows you food sources and of different fats and also some health implications of those fats. So for example, cholesterol, we didn't talk too much about cholesterol. So cholesterol is a type of fat. We actually need cholesterol in our body because we make things like hormones, neurotransmitters. So we do need cholesterol. In fact, our body makes cholesterol. Even if we didn't eat any food in our diet that has cholesterol in it, we would still be making cholesterol. But cholesterol does tend to build up in our arteries, so we do want to try to limit that fat as well. Cholesterol is only found in animal products. Again, things like beef, pork, eggs, shellfish, and dairy. The good news is that wherever you find a lot of saturated fat, there's also cholesterol. So by limiting one type of bad fat, so to speak, you're also going to limit the other type. So it's not like you have to look at two different types of fats. You can look at one and you're going to be limiting both. Okay, so other things about this chart would include, you can see the health implications again of the different types of fats. By lowering your saturated fat in your diet, you're going to help lower your triglycerides and also lower your LDLs. So you can take a look at that at your leisure. I don't have to read through the whole thing. That's what you have the booklet is for. But the chart on page 7 is one thing I do like to point out about this chart, is because it's easy to understand how no matter what food you eat, there's always a combination of different types of fat in the food. However, there's usually a higher percentage of one type of fat. Great example would be canola oil. Canola oil is mostly, that's listed at the top of the chart. That is mostly found mono and polyunsaturated fats from canola oil. Whereas if you look at the food at the very bottom of the chart, which is coconut oil, that has mostly saturated fat as coconut oil. So coconut oil has been touted as having lots of health benefits, and it's true that coconut oil has been researched a lot and has been found to have many health benefits. Unfortunately, it's not cardiac or pulmonary health at this point in time. Is the saturated fat from coconut oil any different from the saturated fat in, say, beef or pork? At this point, scientists have not determined that it's different. So for our heart health, for our pulmonary health, we do want to still limit the coconut oil. Can you rub it on your skin because it's supposed to be really good for your skin? Yes, you can do that, like if it's found in lotions or cosmetic products.
Emergency response, ladies washroom across from New Life. Medical emergency response, ladies washroom across from New Life.
Can you spread it on your skin? Sure, you can do that. The saturated fat won't affect you in that way. But consuming coconut oil is still going to contribute to your saturated fat. So how much saturated fat should you consume? Well, it's recommended to consume less than 10% of your calories from saturated fat. In general, that usually means anywhere from 10 to 15 grams per day. It really depends on your calorie level that you consume. But for the general, like anywhere between 1,800 to 2,500 calories, that's about 10 to 15 grams per day. So can you include coconut oil in your diet? Yes, but count it as towards your saturated fat intake. Other foods that have a high saturated fat amount include, again, butter or dairy fat, like cream, and beef or beef fat, lard. Those all have a high amount of saturated fat. Okay. Our last type of fat that I want to talk about is on page 8 and 9. So we're going to talk about omega-3 fatty acids. So omega-3 fatty acids are a type of polyunsaturated fat, and it has been shown to be heart healthy. We want to include sources of omega-3 fatty acids in our diet. You can find omega-3 fatty acids in fish, and that includes fin fish and shellfish. But fin fish, especially salmon, has a higher amount of omega-3 fatty acids. There's a nice chart again on page 9. It shows you some examples of sources of omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids can help thin the blood. So if you are taking a blood thinner, be sure to check with your doctor before consuming a supplement. It is perfectly fine for you to consume omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. If you're not a fish fan or you're allergic to fish, there are a few other foods that contain omega-3 fatty acids. Seeds and nuts in particular, like walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds, and soybeans all have omega-3 fatty acids in them. And that's, again, the chart on page 9 at the bottom of the page shows some other foods besides fish that have omega-3 fatty acids in them. A few other tips. There's some nice tips on page 8 as far as how to include fish in your diet and enjoying seafood. A lot of people don't like to cook it, but if you do enjoy it, you can use fish in a casserole. You can use fish like a steak. Having fish at a restaurant is sometimes a nice treat if you don't, again, because some people don't like the smell of the fish when it's cooking. Milder fish, if you don't like salmon, because salmon does have a little bit of a stronger smell to it. Tilapia or whitefish is a great choice as well, and it's still going to give you some omega-3 fatty acids. Okay. And then finally, when it comes to fat on page 10, this chart gives you a few examples of meat sources and the amount of fat that you can find in meat. It lists things like poultry, turkey, pork, and beef. For a 3-ounce serving size, for example, a chicken breast, when it's roasted, gives you about 140 calories and about 3 grams of saturated fat. And again, you could look, or I'm sorry, a little under 1 gram of saturated fat. It was 3 grams of total fat. It also gives you the milligrams of cholesterol, 72. But again, when you're watching out for saturated fat and limiting foods that contain those saturated fats, you're also going to be decreasing the amount of cholesterol in your diet as well. But it's nice to have a comparison. So again, the chicken breast has a little under 1 gram of saturated fat for a 3-ounce portion, whereas a tenderloin, a beef tenderloin for a 3-ounce portion is about 175 calories and 3 grams of saturated fat. Now, if you're a beef eater, you can still find some cuts of beef that have lower saturated fat. For example, the eye of round or top round cut will have about 1.5 grams of saturated fat. So, if you're a meat eater and you enjoy having some beef or pork or even chicken in your diet, you can still enjoy those foods. Watch your portion sizes. Or the other thing that can sometimes help is how frequently you eat it. If you typically eat meat every day, try eating meat every other day. And there's some great substitutes for meats. Beans are a really good substitute for meat. And we're going to talk a little bit more about beans when we talk about fiber. Okay. We're going to move on to sodium. So sodium is our next nutrient that we really want to look out for when it comes to pulmonary and cardiac health. And the reason why sodium is important is because sodium affects our blood pressure. So sodium attracts water, and the more fluid in our bloodstream, the more pressure there is on our arteries. So that's kind of a simplified way to explain how sodium affects our blood pressure. Now, sodium is important. It's an electrolyte. It helps with the fluid balance. It also helps with nerve transmission, muscle contraction. So we do need sodium. We find sodium almost everywhere in lots of different foods. But because sodium affects our blood pressure, we again want to limit how much we eat in our diet. Sometimes sodium and salt are used interchangeably, and nothing wrong with that, but just realize that salt is sodium and chloride put together, whereas it's the sodium part of the salt that we really want to look out for. Okay, so where is sodium found in our diet? Well, of course, it's found in salt, table salt, and whether it's table salt, kosher salt, sea salt, Himalayan salt, they all contain sodium. The amount of sodium in each of those differs slightly, but they're all pretty high in sodium. A teaspoon of table salt contains about 2,300 milligrams of sodium, and we want to keep our intake to less than 2,000. So even just a teaspoon of sodium or a teaspoon of salt a day would be over the amount of sodium you want to have in your diet. So what can you use besides salt? There's lots and lots of seasonings and herbs that you can use to help flavor your foods. Oregano, thyme, basil, paprika, cinnamon. You can use aromatics like onions, garlic, celery, carrots to help flavor your foods. There are some salt substitutes that are available in grocery stores. Some of them still have sodium in it, and some of them have potassium instead of sodium. So you do need to check with your doctor to see if you can use a potassium-containing salt substitute, because sometimes if you're on a diuretic, that will affect your potassium as well. Okay, other foods that contain high amounts of sodium that we want to either limit or at least avoid, or that we want to avoid or at least limit in our diet, include anything that's canned or boxed. Anything that's processed is going to have sodium in it because salt is used as a preservative. Before refrigeration came about, people had to find a way to store food, and preservatives, especially salt, was used. So they preserved meat so that the food supply could last longer. But we don't need that anymore. We have lots of storage solutions for our foods. And unfortunately, the sodium content can really affect, again, our blood pressure and our heart health. So again, canned foods, so whether it's canned beans, canned vegetables, canned soups, they all contain a large amount of sodium. You can find low sodium varieties. They're usually about maybe half to a third amount of sodium when you buy a low sodium canned good. Or you can also rinse your canned vegetables, so whether it's green beans or corn or beans, kidney beans, pinto beans, if you rinse the liquid from the food, you're going to decrease the sodium about 25%. Other foods that have a lot of sodium include boxed goods, so things like crackers and chips, instant potatoes, even cereals. So cereals are a great example of a boxed good that don't taste salty but still have a decent amount or a significant amount of sodium in it. And each cereal is different. This is a good example of reading food, how important reading food labels is in looking for things like saturated fat and sodium. That's why we'll come back to reading food labels at the end of the class. So for cereals, some cereals have as much sodium as potato chips, and some cereals have very little sodium in it. So read your food labels when it comes to cereal boxes. Okay, other things that have a lot of sodium include seasonings like soy sauce, Worcestershire sauce, and even ketchup and mustard have some sodium. So with ketchup and mustard, typically we're only using maybe a teaspoon or a tablespoon. It can easily fit to under 2,000 milligrams of sodium in a day. You can find some low sodium ketchup and mustard. But soy sauce is probably a harder product to find to get low sodium. So this is an example of a low sodium soy sauce. Now, even though it says it says less sodium. So less sodium just means that it's lower in sodium than the original product. So this particular soy sauce for a tablespoon still has 575 milligrams of sodium per tablespoon. That means it's over a quarter of your sodium intake for the day if you use a whole serving of soy sauce. So even though it's less, it's still a lot. Regular soy sauce has usually over 800 milligrams of sodium per tablespoon. So watch out for that Chinese food. What can you do to try to still enjoy foods that contain soy sauce, like Chinese foods, but lower the sodium? So if you make it yourself, you can adjust how much soy sauce you use. Use a lower sodium soy sauce, and instead of using the full amount called for in the recipe, use a smaller amount. You still get some flavor, but you have less sodium. There's some other products that may be a little bit lower in sodium than this particular soy sauce. There's a product called coconut aminos. They are probably anywhere between 50 to 150 milligrams of sodium per serving. It's a little bit harder to find on store shelves, but it is out there if you're a big Chinese food lover. Okay, other things about food labels and sodium is there's a great chart again on page 11, and it gives an example of if you're reading the food label, what the terms mean. For example, sodium-free or salt-free means that the product has less than 5 milligrams of sodium per serving. Very low sodium means it's less than 35 milligrams. Low sodium is less than 140. Those are all really good choices. Reduced or light in sodium, or like this one is less sodium, just means that it's lower than the original food. And then finally, unsalted If a product is listed as unsalted, it just means no salt is added during the processing of the food in comparison to the original product. But again, be careful with those. Really, again, read the food label, because a good example would be saltine crackers. So saltine crackers can be unsalted. That just means that there's no salt sprinkled on top of the saltine. There's still salt or sodium that's in the cracker itself. So it's lower in sodium, but not completely sodium free. Okay, our next topic as far as nutrition is concerned would be fiber. We want to have fiber in our diet for many reasons. First, fiber has no calories because our body does not digest it. So it gives us a feeling of fullness and satiety without contributing any calories. Fiber can also help bulk up the stool and help with bowel movements. And then fiber is found in plant products. So fiber foods, or foods that contain lots of fiber, are often heart healthy for many reasons, because of fiber and because it's lower in saturated fat. Okay, so what foods contain fiber? Well, I mentioned plant products. So probably beans are the highest in fiber. So anything like kidney beans, garbanzo beans, pinto beans, even lentils like black-eyed peas, red lentils. There's a whole slew of different types of beans, all heart healthy products. Again, if it's canned products are easier to cook. You don't have to cook the beans for as long when they're canned. So either choose a low sodium canned bean or drain and rinse the bean when using canned beans. Other foods that are really high in fiber would include whole grains. So whole grains would include things like whole wheat, rye, barley, oatmeal, quinoa, rice. Those are all really good choices. When you're buying a whole grain, you do want to look for the word whole, especially on bread. So for example, here's an example of a label a bread label. It says 100% whole wheat. So the word whole indicates that the whole grain is used rather than being refined grain. So one other thing I want to mention about breads is that it's another, like cereal, it can be high in sodium, but yet it doesn't taste salty. So that's another good example of reading your food labels and looking for the sodium in bread products. Okay, so other whole grain things, like I said, instead of white rice, you do want to choose brown rice, because that would be a whole grain, whereas white rice is refined. I mentioned quinoa. Oatmeal is a really good choice for a whole grain, whether it's steel cut or quick oatmeal or old-fashioned oatmeal. Again, you're still getting the fiber in the oatmeal. And the oatmeals you do want to look out for or avoid would be the instant pack with the seasoning or the flavoring, because that adds more sugar and, of course, more calories. Okay, other foods that contain fiber are your fruits and vegetables. Apples, oranges, pears, nectarines, bananas, you name it, it's going to have some fiber. Same thing with vegetables. Broccoli, peas, carrots, they're all great sources of fiber. Doesn't matter if you choose fresh or frozen, they're both good choices, they're both going to have the fiber. In fact, for convenience use, if it's not in the summertime when lots of fresh fruits or vegetables are available, frozen fruits and vegetables are a great choice, because they're typically picked when they're ripe and they're frozen very quickly, and they retain a lot of the nutrients that way. Just look out for your canned fruits and vegetables. You want your canned fruits to be canned in juice rather than in syrup. And then for your canned vegetables, again, you look out for the sodium. Okay, and then I think we covered all of our fiber foods. Let's turn to page 14, and it gives some general guidelines, kind of trying to sum it up all together for heart health and pulmonary health. Some of the recommendations, again, you can read these for yourself, but just to review, we want to reduce the saturated fat. along with a few other fats, but really in particular it's the saturated fats we want to concentrate on. I'm sorry, for the saturated fats, no more than 5 to 6%. I said 10% last time, and it's 5 to 6%. Sorry about that. But it's still, that equals to about 10 to 15 grams of fat per day. Okay, I wanted to correct myself there. Other things that we can do to try to have a heart-healthy diet is weight control, and that would include not just diet but exercise, and then fluid intake. So water is really the best choice for fluid intake, but other fluids can still be heart healthy. So if you do enjoy juice, try to keep your intake to just 1 serving of juice a day, because juice does count as your fruit serving, but juice does not give you the fiber like the whole fruit does. So 4 ounces of juice is considered a serving. And then other fluids would include things like tea and coffee. People sometimes ask about the caffeine that's found in tea and coffee for cardiac and pulmonary patients. So every cardiologist may have a little bit of a different opinion, but in general, the average of 2 cups of coffee a day is considered acceptable for the amount of caffeine. And when I say 2 cups, or 2 servings of coffee, a serving is 6 ounces for a cup of coffee, not the store-bought large size, which is typically 12 or 16 ounces. So about 12 ounces a day of coffee, caffeinated coffee. Otherwise, decaf is perfectly fine, or herbal teas is fine as well. Okay. Things you do want to try to avoid are beverages with added sugar. Okay. The last 2 pages, on pages 15 and 16, I shouldn't say the last 2, almost the last 2 pages, 15 and 16, again gives you a nice summary of foods that are good choices, okay choices, and not so good choices. So it kind of goes through each food group with proteins, dairy, seasonings, fats and oils, fruits, vegetables, and even gives you some ideas for snacks on page 16. The last page does talk a little bit about eating out. So when going out to eat, some difficulties do arise. Restaurants are notorious for larger portion sizes and for high sodium content. Some restaurants do have some helpful hints as far as trying to find heart-healthy foods. Sometimes they give you a little icon, like a little heart, next to foods that are heart-healthy. Oftentimes, though, that means that they're lower in fat or lower in calories, but it doesn't often mean that they're lower in sodium. So be on the lookout for sodium at restaurants. One thing you can do is ask your server for the cook or chef to not salt your foods before serving it to you, because sometimes restaurants will just salt after the food is plated. The other thing is even making a special request for things like unsalted French fries, and some restaurants can accommodate that for you. Other things that can be kind of hidden suggestions or hidden foods at restaurants. Sometimes soups and sauces, ask for sauces on the side, especially things like salad dressings. Salad dressings have both fat and salt in them, and by you controlling how much you use rather than the server or the chef pouring the dressing on, again, you're going to have a little bit in your diet, but you control how much. Usually a vinaigrette is a better choice as far as fat is concerned, because it's more unsaturated fat rather than saturated fat from like a ranch dressing. And then a homemade dressing, when you're cooking at home, is actually a really good choice, because you can control the amount of sodium in it as well. Okay. The other thing about dining out, of course, is I mentioned the portion sizes. So when you order out and you receive your plate of food, one recommendation that works really well for a lot of people is cutting your food in half and setting it to the side, asking for a to-go container right away and putting it into the to-go container, and that way you're limiting your portion sizes before you even begin to eat. Okay. I do want to go back and talk a little bit about reading the food label, and that's on page 3. So on page 3, it gives you an example of a food label, and we'll go over it here. So first thing to look at on a food label is what a serving size is. That's listed on the top of the food label. A serving size can be listed typically in common measurements like cups or teaspoons or tablespoons, but it could also be listed in grams, and that's usually by weight when it talks about grams. So if you have a scale at home that measures in grams, it's really helpful, but not necessary. And then all the information that's listed as far as the nutrition information is all based on a serving size. So for the nutrition facts label that's in your book, a serving size is 1.5 cups. And for every serving, there's 240 calories. And again, you can look at the grams of the different nutrients or the amounts of the different nutrients. And then it also gives a percentage, which is called the percent daily value. What the percent daily value means is that if you were to eat one serving of this food, it would be giving you, for example, 8% of your saturated fat for an average adult, and that's 2,000 calories. So those percentages don't apply to everybody if you consume less than 2,000 or more than 2,000 calories. But for an average adult who's eating 2,000 calories, you can at least use this as a guideline. And in actuality, average adult eats more than 2,000 calories, but that's what the food label is based on. Okay, what the percent daily value is helpful for are things like your vitamins and minerals listed at further down the food label. So for vitamin D, if you consume a serving of this food, you would be getting about 10% of the vitamin D for an average adult, and that is helpful to know. Or something like calcium and iron. You would be getting 20% of your calcium and 35% of your iron with one serving of this food. So that's really helpful if you want some higher calcium containing foods or higher iron containing foods. You can use that percentage. So if you're looking out for calcium and iron in your diet and you want good sources of those nutrients, using the percent daily value is a good way to do that. Okay. So reading the food label on foods is really, really helpful for monitoring how much saturated fat you consume, how much sodium, or any other nutrient that you want to monitor. Okay, lastly, I want to talk a little bit about 2 other topics, and that's sugars and then alcohol. And we don't really highlight those in the book a lot, but I know people typically have questions about those 2 components of food. So as far as sugar is concerned, usually it's the added sugars that we want to look out for, and that's because added sugars provide calories but without any other nutrients. So and more calories typically means more weight gain. So looking out for those added sugars. When I give you lots of suggestions, sometimes people are overwhelmed with what do I do first or how do I start? And my suggestion is pick 1 or 2 things that you want to work on when it comes to trying to move towards a heart-healthy diet, and until you get a handle on those 2 things. So whether it's looking out for your saturated fat, monitoring your serving sizes, looking out for sodium, counting calories, whatever it is you choose to make your priority, focus on those 1 or 2 things, and then you can move on to something else until you get a handle on your priorities again. Okay, lastly would be the alcohol. People often ask, can I still drink alcohol? Well, first recommendation is that if you don't drink alcohol, do not start. Any benefits that you may get from drinking alcohol do not outweigh the downsides of drinking alcohol. If you do enjoy alcohol every once in a while, then what's recommended is 1 to 2 glasses a day. So 1 glass typically for women, 2 glasses for a man. That's kind of just in general based on body weight, but 1 to 2 glasses a day. So what counts as a glass? For beer, it's 12 ounces is considered one serving. For wine, it's 5 ounces, which is a little bit more than a half a cup. And then for hard alcohol, it's a shot glass, which is 1.5 ounces of hard liquor. So that's considered a serving of alcohol. With alcohol, the recommendation does not add up at the end of the week. You cannot add up your 1 to 2 servings a day and have them all on Fridays. So be sure to, like I said, if you don't drink alcohol, I recommend that you continue to do that. But if you do enjoy, whether it's a glass of wine or an occasional beer, again, no more than 1 to 2 glasses a day. Thank you very much for viewing this information about a heart healthy and cardiac and pulmonary rehab.